when I create imagery of, massively scaled vertical farms as a solution to the global agro-industrial complex, I get a lot of pushback because the future isn't green anymore. It doesn't look like that model of utopian localism. It looks like massive towers of produce grown under purple LED light. It doesn't look like people in log cabins in rolling green hills in community co-ops. It looks like high-density urban living in really compact and efficient ways. It looks like massive fields of solar mirrors and wind turbines. It probably looks, unfortunately, like some degree of nuclear, energy in our future. They're often truths that are really hard to come to terms with, and it really hurts to think that we've let ourselves get to a point where this is what aspirational futures really look like.
All right, I'm joined today by Liam Young. Liam, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Yeah, of course, it's been a long time coming.
It has indeed. We spoke recently. I realized I wanted to start us in a different place based on a recent conversation we had. Planet punk. What is planet punk?
Right. Yeah. So, I'm obviously a massive consumer fan, thinker around science fiction, and I've been interested in the different forms that science fiction thinking has taken across time. Where cyberpunk, imagines the messy subcultures of the virtual. Solarpunk imagines the subcultural implications around the technologies of ecotech. Steampunk, what Bruce Sterling often talks about as what happens when goths discover the color brown. Thinks about reimagining, obviously, the industrial age in the context of science fiction. And these punks have, just like their namesake punk in music and fashion and so on, have really existed in forms as resistance against technologies or against the dominant zeitgeist in that moment. And I think they've been really useful as a chronicle of the time in which they were created, to offer some kind of friction against dominant narratives. In many ways, that's why I'm interested in science fiction, is it creates counter-narratives for the world in which we exist in. And you take something like cyberpunk, which unfortunately have become this default aesthetic of the future for our age. Like if you see glistening neon reflecting in rainy streets, you somehow presume future. It's become a sort of shorthand. But if you really think about it, at the moment in which it was created, it was actually really critical as a counter-narrative. Think about, 1980s, the original Blade Runner and so on, Gibson's Neuromancer, the novel where the word cyberspace first appears. Like, these are really critical moments pushing back against the rise of consumer electronics. So in this moment, everyone's walking around with a Sony Walkman. Everyone's starting to have VHS video recorders in their homes. Everything cool is made in Japan. So there's this real fear of a rising other coming from the outsourcing of American industry to Asia and the then export of all of those technologies that at that moment become extraordinarily desirable. So cyberpunk really is a term we use to talk about so much of that science fiction of the age, which visualizes a sort of rising Asian superpower, or at very least an Asian American hybrid. And it's really interesting chronicling the fears of Western nations in that moment, and it becomes really instrumental in thinking about a future of technology and what are the subcultural implications of all of these things that we're now carrying around with us. And it's a real tragedy that cyberpunk has now just become kind of a cliche and a trope and an excuse for another form of extraction of Asian culture by the West. But in the moments when these punks are created, they're actually really valuable. So I start to think like what constitutes a form of sci-fi punk today. You know, we can talk about climate fiction and climate punk. I talk about planetary punk because so much of the work that I do involves the visualization of planetary scale futures, planetary scale forms of computation, reimagining infrastructural models at the scale of the globe. And most of my work, I guess I would characterize as new forms of planetary punk in that way, trying to give voice to what I think is a really necessary future narrative today, which is visualizing new planetary imaginaries.
Which is a perfect setup to Planet City, but I want to insert a prologue or invite you to share a prologue, because a lot of people hear the word world building and they maybe have a vague understanding of what it is. But I think you could really help shape the understanding of Planet City by first explaining what world building is as a practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm loosely often called a world builder, but most often I'm called a speculative architect because my background is in architecture. I don't design and make buildings as physical objects. I mean, I used to work for some of the star architects of our age, like Zaha Hadid and so on, but I very quickly moved away from crafting buildings as physical objects in the world into thinking about the architectural, the urban, the infrastructural implications of new technologies and the impacts that those technologies might have on space and how we interact across space. But my training is in traditional architecture. I'm trained as an architect back in Australia, of all places. And really my approach to world building comes out of that practice where, to a large extent, the way that architects operate is that they're given some kind of site, often an empty piece of land or an existing building that's in need of reimagining, and we construct a site drawing. And that's generally the biggest scale drawing that architects might produce. And that site drawing deals with things like adjacencies of scale, circulation routes, maybe at best like solar paths and shadows and things like that. But really, that's the extent of the problem. Like what falls off the edge of a site plan, architects don't really think about. But in a globalized world, nothing occurs on a single site anymore. There's no such thing as a discrete location in the world, whether it be the design of a building or the design of a mobile phone that's the scale of your pocket. The things that we create, craft, and design have implications on planetary scales. So what is a design practice that includes that scale of relationships and the interconnected tendrils of things? And world building is really, I think, maybe it's a very different definition to what a lot of other people would think about as a world building practice. But for me, world building is a mode of thinking at all scales of the design problem, thinking about not only the design of an object or a product or a building or a space or a piece of clothing or a shoe, but thinking about all of the connections that that object sets in motion around the planet, right? So even, traditionally in architecture, when you're specifying a particular material for a building you're designing, that material has a global footprint. When you make a choice about the titanium case on an iPhone, you're in effect terraforming and you're creating causal effects that reverberate across the entirety of the earth. The things that we do at the scale of these objects, especially now at the scale of an electric car battery or at the scale of a mobile phone, whatever it may be, we are creating extraordinary consequences on the other side of the earth. And world building is a process that imagines and includes a thinking about the world that these things sit within. And I really think it's the kind of the design genre or discipline of our generation. If we're not thinking at these kind of scales, what on earth are we doing? We're in this extraordinary moment where product design and landscape design have kind of compressed together and essentially are the same thing, one of the great tragedies, and one of the reasons I'm here at SciArc is because traditionally in design schools, scales of design teaching operate in really siloed capacities. Like architects deal with the scale of a building, a product designer deals with the scale of products, interiors deal with the stuff inside buildings, landscape architecture deals with the stuff around buildings, urban design deals with, collaborations and congregations of buildings. But really, like, where does planetary design fit into that? And world building, I think, is a practice that brings all those things together. So I run a master's program, essentially a master's in world building, as a means to say that those siloed scales of design thinking are extraordinarily problematic for this potential moment. So we need to start to talk about different forms of practice, and world building is essentially that.
And when you share that with folks, what have you found the response to be? Because of course you are, as you mentioned, kind of butting up against very, very hard-walled silos.
Yeah, I mean, but what world building can also do is find very accessible forms through which you can disseminate and communicate complex ideas, right? Like, we all live in worlds and we all have an understanding and a fluency through which to understand those worlds. And we have a literacy, of worlds, right? And we can take really complex ideas about, how we might reformulate or reimagine a world or its systems and present them in a way that feels immersive and believable, that people can connect to. And in a way, you're cutting through a lot of that complexity. We often use phrases like world picturing or world imaging. And that is a process where you create cohesive imagery of a speculative world that is a condensation of, hugely complex scenarios and systems thinking, but you're able to present it in a way that people can really dive into. And good world building is about consistency, and that consistency creates believability. That believability creates immersion, and being immersed in these contexts really helps you to understand and to see the implications of complex ideas. So, I think my success as an artist, and I often talk about, as an artist, my medium isn't painting or film, my medium is worlds. I think that my success as an artist is often defined by that, in that, if someone's doing a show on climate change, I might get an email because I can talk about the complexity of those issues in a way that doesn't feel didactic, in a way that doesn't feel preachy, because I'm using those systems of world imaging and making, and they become more accessible, and more general audiences can start to engage with those stories in a way that maybe a traditional fine art practice is more privileged. So, in general, I think the reception is great. I mean, I'm also in Hollywood. The currency of Hollywood right now is worlds. And no one's buying scripts anymore. They're buying worlds, because a world is, as we describe it, medium agnostic, right? Like, again, as an artist, I make films, but I also make costumes and props that are extracted from those films. I can make a graphic novel set in one of my worlds. I can invite a whole group of other science fiction authors to inhabit that world and create their own stories, and other artists to inhabit that world and find their own narratives. And Hollywood loves that, because you can create a series, you can create a prequel series, you can create a spin-off movie, you can create a video game, an immersive experience, a graphic novel series, series of books, a bunch of fan fictions inside that world. So everyone wants a world. So again, world building is in many ways the currency of our age, as opposed to the script. So, I think there's great interest in worlds as a practice, and world building, again, unfortunately, has become a bit of a catchphrase today, but really it's born out of a necessity to think at planetary scales, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, you also work with theorists and scientists, and what we learn from them is we're in an emergency, and that type of interdependent thinking is kind of our only way out of this mess, or not even that we'd ever arrive at a state where we're out of the mess, but to start to ameliorate some of the harms. Planet City. I feel like now we have to get into, you have this radical ongoing world building artwork world. So let's just start with, what is Planet City?
Yeah, I mean, Planet City is a future city, a vision of a future city, a model of a future city for the entire population of the Earth. So it begins with the thinking of Edward O. Wilson, who had a proposal that he called Half Earth, which was a plan to stave off mass extinction by devoting half the surface of the Earth to nature, and thereby restricting human development to the other half that would remain. And it's a really kind of radical proposal that meets the radical crises that we find ourselves in. And because of the discipline that he exists within, that of ecology and environmental thinking, a lot of people have been thinking about the way that you might scaffold the recovery of landscapes in that 50% of the planet that we leave untouched. Again, trained as an architect, I'm like, well, how on earth would we possibly retreat to the other 50%? And if we imagine that we all live in a planet city today, we live in a planetary scaled city, we have terraformed the entirety of the Earth, from the scale of the cell to the tectonic plate, from tundra to tropic, everything is city already. Even landscapes we think of as being seemingly empty are somehow either a product of the city or produce the city in many cases. So 50% of the planet represents a radical reimagining of what we think of as city and our endless sprawl that we've created for ourselves. So what would that look like? And that's where we started. It was like, how would it be possible to kind of densify and shrink to that 50%? But as we started doing our research, we looked at cities like Manila. Manila is the current densest city on Earth. Kowloon Walled City is the densest piece of urban fabric ever constructed in human history. We looked at these kind of models, and really at the density of a place like Manila, you can put 10 billion people, at once the projected global population of the world in 2050, in a city about the size of Texas. So not 50% of Earth, but 0.02% of Earth. So that most radical imagining of the Half Earth project, or the most radical imagining of this kind of densification, became Planet City. The Planet City is this pinpoint on a map where all of human form exists as a means to return almost the entirety of the Earth to some form of landscape, to make space for other species we once thought were beneath us, to essentially create a global national park, to return stolen lands, to reverse a colonial practice, to give back territory for all the sorts of things that currently our urban form competes with, and to visualize then what that city might be and what it might look like and how it might work. And how it works is really important. It is a real working model of a city. It's born out of collaboration between myself and, as a curator of the project, and what I call the City Council, which is a global network of scientists and technologists and political theorists and science fiction authors and energy experts and so on, to make a real working city at this most ridiculous of scales. Not to say like, hey, I've figured it out, I've got the solution. Jesse, pack your bags. On Tuesday, we're moving to Planet City. It's over at, in Brazil, the mouth of the Amazon. We're done. But instead to say, look, if we can get this working at this most ridiculous of scales, there's nothing stopping us reimagining a city like Los Angeles or London or Sydney. The only thing standing in our way is our own political prejudices, our own biases and blind spots. The big takeaway of the project is really to say that climate change is no longer a technological problem. It's a cultural and political problem. It's a crisis of the imagination, not a crisis of technology. We're not waiting for some billionaire to solve things for us, or to crack nuclear fusion, or to figure out space mining. Instead, we can do all of these things that we need to do today. We could wake up tomorrow and make everything better because the systems required to do so are already here. They've been here for 10 or 15 years. They're proven and they're tested. And that's an extraordinarily powerful place to be. It's also an extraordinarily depressing place to be because we're not going to wake up tomorrow and do these things, but we could. So Planet City was meant to be a project that introduces and talks about that conversation and forces us to say, well, why aren't we doing these things? What is standing in our way? And to get people excited about that conversation and to visualize themselves in this possible future.
When those conversations happen, do you find that there's recurring themes of what's standing in the way?
Yeah, I mean, Planet City as a project, along with a lot of my work, is quite provocative and divisive. I mean, there's a Planet City TED Talk, and I've never been scolded more than when I walked off the stage at TED, because TED is a solutionist format, right? A bunch of people getting up there and in their 8 minutes presenting a solution to the world, essentially, asking for investment or buy-in. Planet City doesn't operate in those terms at all. It's not a solution. As I mentioned, it's a provocation to try and get people to think about their futures in different ways. But a lot of people read it as a solution, both because people are so desperate for solutions, but also because they're desperate for easy answers, and because people so often read futures as either predictions or proposals. So a big part of my work has been to try and figure out what the role of these projects might be and how they might exist in the world in different ways. And essentially all of my work in Planet City is the most notable example of it, are what I describe as new planetary imaginaries. And part of the friction comes from the fact that when we close our eyes and we think about futures, we often land on the same kinds of images, especially when we're thinking about hopeful or aspirational futures. And those images are born out of the extraordinary work that has existed since the 60s and 70s. It's born out of a particular ideology of early ecology and environmentalism that comes out of that period. And it's often difficult for people, especially for people on the left, actually, because so many extraordinary thinkers and people have devoted their lives to that ideology and to that model of thinking about the future, a model that's predicated often on forms of localism, trees on rooftops and green-lined streets, and the idea that any viable future means we're going to be growing our own food in our backyards and recycling our milk cartons and having neighborhood chicken farms that create eggs for everyone in a mile radius and so on. And the great tragedy is that a lot of that thinking, a lot of that imagery, the imagery that still today is the default imagery through which we think about an aspirational future, is just no longer fit for purpose. Maybe if we listened in the 60s and 70s, we had a chance at that kind of future, but we've blown past that long ago. And that's really hard to accept. And we don't really have any imagery to fill that void that does work at scale, that is pragmatic in the context of the polycrisis we've found ourselves in. So never mind actually doing any meaningful steps towards these futures, we don't really have any shared consensus on what they actually are. And when I create imagery of, massively scaled vertical farms as a solution to the global agro-industrial complex, I get a lot of pushback because the future isn't green anymore. It doesn't look like that model of utopian localism. It looks like massive towers of produce grown under purple LED light. It doesn't look like people in log cabins in rolling green hills in community co-ops. It looks like high density urban living in really compact and efficient ways. it looks like massive fields of solar mirrors and wind turbines. It probably looks, unfortunately, like some degree of nuclear, energy in our future. And they're often truths that are really hard to come to terms with. And it really hurts to think that we've let ourselves get to a point where this is what viable, aspirational futures really look like. So all of my work is an attempt to put into the world this kind of imagery so that we can have new, more contemporary conversations about what our futures could look like. But again, like they often get pushback because they're uncomfortable images. It's uncomfortable to think that in today's world, the most organic strawberry on earth is grown in a warehouse in New Jersey. It's not grown on a piece of land passed down across generations under the sun and blue skies. It's grown with very little water resources, no pesticides, because it's essentially grown in a closed room environment in a test facility of a vertical farm in Jersey. But for all measures and in all ways that we measure organics, it's there as the future of how we might sustainably grow high nutrient, good food. And that really runs contrary to all of the models of thinking that the left has kind of cited itself within. So again, in many ways, it's the project of our generation is to kind of create these new, more pragmatic and viable images of a future that we might start to try and work towards. And in most cases, those images of new planetary futures are dystopian. They're the work of the Bond villain or the evil megacorporation. Like these big images of systemic planetary change, have been the workings of dystopian visions for so long. How do we reverse that? And that's a big cultural project. But if we talk about climate change as no longer being a technological problem, but being a cultural problem, then that's the front lines of the discourse. That's the front lines of the problem.
I love that. It has me in mind of a conversation that comes up a lot across cultural and political conversations in my world. It's not, this isn't for everybody, is the kind of purity politics that plays out among the left and how that ends up being its undoing. How, and I'm not wanting to risk falling into the trap of like the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, like abundance narrative, because I think that's wrong for starters, and secondly, problematic beyond that. But I think we can look around and kind of identify things like what you're saying and see how good intentions, like an impulse toward relocalization, that is a good intention, and there are good outcomes from doing that. But that we're stuck inside massive scale. And we have to work within scale, even as we recognize it sucks that we have to work within scale. So I guess the broader question I have, and I know that in some ways the answer is just like Planet City, but like, how do you make determinations about the kind of hot button topics, like when you're identifying things as pragmatic versus not? How do you make determinations about which one of those flashpoints to push into as a provocation to that kind of nostalgic thinking for a world that could have been?
Yeah, I mean, the key collaborators on a lot of these worlds are scientists. Like, we just listen to the science, really. Like, my follow-up project to Planet City is called The Great Endeavor, which is a visualization of the planetary network of carbon removal infrastructure that we're going to need to create in our generation. And it was really born out of the observation that technology, again, especially by the left, has really been demonized, because carbon removal technology, this is like giant extraction fans and machines that suck 300 years of billowing black smoke out of our air and turn it into a liquid that essentially can then be injected into rock to be permanently stored. I mean, rocks are essentially just carbon, right? But the dominant use case for carbon capture right now is the fossil fuel industry. These are the people doing it at scale because they're able to continue business as usual. Like carbon removal has become an alibi for the continuation of the fossil fuel industry, or even the scaling up of the fossil fuel industry. And a lot of those fossil fuel companies are getting US tax rebates because they're fracking with captured carbon as a means to extract more dead dinosaurs out of the earth. It's absolutely bizarre. And quite rightfully, those scenarios have been really latched onto as being like the exact reason why we shouldn't be doing those forms of carbon removal. But at the same time, to demonize a technology because of a dominant use case is really short-term thinking and limits its possibilities, because there is no viable future without some degree of carbon removal. And we started that project when the big global carbon report came out, and we were talking about these emissions targets that we're trying to hit, and the media narrative kind of always latches on to like trying to hit future emissions targets. But if you actually read the fine print, you realize that all of those targets are predicated on an assumed amount of like gigaton scale
magical
carbon
amounts.
removal that we're going to do in parallel. So even the targets we're trying to hit, which we're not going to hit, we're blowing past already, are actually based on doing carbon removal anyway. So there's really no way of thinking about a future without some massive degree of carbon removal. And the alternatives are, sure, to plant a planet of trees, but they're slow, that process, until a forest becomes carbon positive, it actually takes a really long time. But at the same time, it's not a robust solution. There may be a change of government in Brazil, and some idiot decides that farmland is more productive and economically viable than keeping carbon in the ground, and generations of work to build that tree stock back up is gone in 4 years. But capturing carbon and turning it into rock and storing it for eternity in that rock actually is a robust solution. So we made this work, great endeavor, to visualize this planetary scaled project, to visualize a scale of international collaboration never before seen that would be required to build what would be humanity's largest ever construction project. And if you do the math and listen to the science, literally in our generation, we need to build an infrastructure equivalent in scale to the current fossil fuel industry to do the reverse, to push it back in the ground. That means every pipeline, every gas plant, every oil rig that currently exists on Earth, we need to build again to do the opposite. And we don't even talk about it. Or if we do, we talk about it in a negative sense about why we shouldn't be doing it. So we create that work as a means to visualize what it could look like, but also to visualize in a way that isn't trying to be divisive, but rather to try and appeal to both sides of the aisle, to talk about and to use the language of the great endeavor in the same breath as we might have talked about the moon landing, or the joining of coasts with railways, the building of vertical New York, these great aspirational projects of humanity, the joining of oceans with a canal, to talk about it as job creation, to talk about the massive labor force that would be required to do it, to work with Lyra Pramik, an extraordinary musician, to create a new planetary workers song, to think about the big communal effort that would be required to make this thing, so that it's not just a conversation of environmental justice or decolonizing the sky and the sort of language that typically would be used on the left to describe this. But it's an attempt to find language that brings everyone with us. To try and talk about the ways that this thing could actually happen, and the necessity for it to happen, and the way that it could happen that doesn't perpetuate existing colonial models of infrastructure being essentially the tool of colonialism across history, how can you think about this new carbon infrastructure and carbon economy as a way of reimagining and redressing the global north-south forms of extractivism. So it becomes, a really controversial project, but I hope it's a kind of necessary project. So, it's a long way of answering a very simple question. We find our worlds and the projects and the narratives we want to talk about through thinking about what are the necessary conversations we should be having, what are the difficult conversations we should be having, who are the scientists that are screaming right now for attention, and how can we use our capacity as artists, our aesthetic practice, our cinematic imagery to find ways to connect people to that science in really meaningful and productive forms.
Okay, so first, shout out Lyra. Everybody should go listen to Hymnal. Amazing new album. Also watch the Great Endeavor film. You worked with Holly Jean Buck on that, and she weighed into the geoengineering question with After Geoengineering. Also, great book. Go read that book. And so carbon capture sits under this broader umbrella of geoengineering. I guess maybe to start, I'd want to double click on the conversation we were just having around the broader geoengineering question and thinking about Jevons paradox, where, any efficiency gain you make gets eaten up by newly created demand. This gets talked about a lot in, electrification circles. Do you have, first of all, an overall take around geoengineering, which is maybe related to what we were just talking about? And then secondly, how do we, even within that, mitigate some of the possible harms that then come when we do undertake this great endeavor without giving license to just keep on, burn baby or drill baby drill?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of the pushback against geoengineering, and hopefully we've moved past these narratives, but maybe we haven't, is that, we start playing God and, you shouldn't mess with nature, and all of these narratives that assume that somehow nature is this rare and precious, untouched thing. And technology has always been a driver in natural change, and for as long as practically viable. And we exist in a geoengineered Earth. Again, when I talk about Planet City, when I do my Planet City storytelling performances, I often run two planetary cities against each other. The fiction of Planet City, as we've been talking about, but also the reality of the planetary city we all occupy. And again, we have terraformed and geoengineered the entirety of the Earth. I have a book called Machine Landscapes, the Architectures of the Post-Anthropocene, that really was an attempt to argue for this conception of the world that we've created, which isn't the Anthropocene in the sense that humans have kind of are the dominant force shaping the Earth, but beyond that, machines and our technologies are the forces that really have been shaping the world that we now find ourselves in. So I'm far less precious about notions of geoengineering because that's the position that I occupy. And it's a position that often runs in contradiction to a lot of urban and architectural thinking. Rem Koolhaas, the kind of the godfather of thinking about the city in our contemporary generation of architects, completed a massive project called The Countryside, which was his big play and pivot from thinking about the city since the 80s to then in the 2000s thinking about its opposite, the countryside. But that still predicates some kind of center periphery dialectic that I don't think exists anymore. There is no center or edge, core or periphery. There's just this continuous urban form across the entirety of the Earth, and you need to think about landscapes as being complicit in that form because, as I said, they often produce that urban form or their remainders and waste landscapes of that form. So we have already been doing geoengineering. We just don't brand it as such. We have already been engineering the climate. So to deploy technology to not put more dinosaurs in the sky, but to start to put them back in the ground seems to be a very natural extension of the world that we've already created for ourselves. So, that's not to dismiss the necessary research that we should be doing around all these systems, but it's to say we should be doing that research. And so Holly, quite controversially talks about solar engineering, but she doesn't say like, hey, let's launch the stuff. We should do it. She doesn't talk about it in a boosterist way, but she says like, look, we really should do the research. Is this viable? Is this catastrophic? Is this too dangerous to look at? Or is it a possible solution? We need to have that conversation. But reactions to and contemporary takes on geoengineering says, how dare we? We shouldn't come anywhere near that stuff. But the science just says, well, let's explore it. So that's really my position. And in a way, it's also the way that I would answer the second part of your question, in that, like, the research is what's going to mitigate that. We're in an extraordinary moment where we simultaneously have the capacity to model, map, and understand the situation we find ourselves in, as well as being able to deploy those same tools to model possible solutions. And there's great histories of when science goes wrong. I'm from Australia, particularly from Queensland. The mascot of our rugby league team is the cane toad. A geoengineering project, essentially. There was, the cane toad being introduced to eradicate the sugarcane beetle that was killing sugar crops, that never could eat that beetle at all in the first place. They both existed in different areas of the soil and plant structure, and now this massive pest is moving from the east coast across and is extraordinarily devastating. And there's hundreds of examples of processes when that goes wrong, but our science is so different now, and the checks and balances around that research and that science is so different. We need to allow these extraordinary people space to do this work and to test out and explore these solutions, because there really just isn't any viable alternative. Maybe if we were balancing geoengineering against all these other really workable strategies, you would think twice about the radical scales at which they operate. But there isn't viable, pragmatic alternatives. I mean, at least not if you subscribe to the idea that our general worldview and our general models of governance and capitalism aren't going to radically change in our lifetimes. This is as good as it gets. And cling to some naive ambition that we're going to rewire the entirety of the planet and its global and political economic system. There just isn't time to continue to fight on that ground. We need to find ways and solutions that exist within these models, and that's maybe an extremely pragmatic approach to the thinking, but this is where we are. There's not time to mess around.
Yeah, I mean, basically every option is bad. The question is, what's not only the lesser of many evils, but what's the option that buys us time to then re-intervene at some later date? Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic that I'm sort of pulling from this, and that I often pull from your work, of like, you're addressing an unrealistic form of thinking, which is to say that there's some perfect solution we just haven't found yet, and we should wait till we have that solution. But you're using almost hyperbolic scale, unrealistic, realistic world building to both communicate that is a reality as a sort of oppositional stance, but then also to try to create a space for people to think through like their version of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also, I'm an artist and I operate and exist in those terms. Planet City, there's another version of Planet City, which is the real viable solution version of it, which is to say, like, not let's all move to one giant megacity and return 99% of the planet to nature, but instead is like, well, let's just look at city by city, the consolidation that we can do. Let's just take Los Angeles and like how we can introduce more food production at the sites in which it's consumed, how we can reverse the sprawl of the city and start to densify neighborhoods, how we can think about the recycling of our waste within the footprint of the Los Angeles area and not export it, and so on. But it wouldn't get the same headlines that Planet City got. I don't think I'd be doing a TED talk on the reimagining of LA. So I'm trying to find ways in these early stages of the conversation around these new planetary imaginaries to literally capture the imagination of the public. And again, with the great endeavor, we shouldn't attempt to capture all of the carbon we need to in 2 sites on Earth, located around the windiest point on Earth where we'd build the world's largest wind farm, or the sunniest point on Earth where we build the world's largest solar farm, as the great endeavor starts to visualize. But instead, we would do carbon removal everywhere, at all scales, at points of its production, and around the carbon capture of really hard to eliminate emissions, as well as sites with really cheap energy, like in Iceland, and capturing geothermals to power carbon removal and so on. We should be doing it everywhere. But again, like, that incremental, small acupunctural project just doesn't capture the imagination in the same way that humanity's largest construction project does. And again, if we try and talk about the massive cultural turn that is necessary, then those big, bombastic, hyperbolic statements, I think, can still be really valuable and productive, especially in these early stages of the conversation. At the very least, they can start to direct us to the science that underpins those big narratives, and start to get us to talk about, well, what does viable carbon removal start to look like? What does forms of densification look like? What does new forms of food production look like? And we can start to engage in that at these smaller scales once we're into the conversation. And I just think that, like, there's something to be said for the accessibility of these big ideas. In my world, in the art world, we often use accessible as a term of derision. Like, oh, this artist that, they're really terrible and they're just really accessible. But if we're not making work that the ambitions of which is to connect people to our ideas, then what are we doing it for? The rarefied, privileged bubbles that most of this work occupies, in gallery context, in museum context, in context of the left, like, how much more are we going to be screaming into the void or shouting in echo chambers? We're really good at talking to our friends and colleagues and making work for the same audience that cycles around the world at the triennales and biennales and so on. But, I'm really interested in the forms of practice that open those doors open and let people in to these conversations in ways that they might connect with. So I try and make accessible work, and part of doing that is to create narratives that warrant and invite discourse and discussion. It's part of why I moved from Europe to Los Angeles, to somehow co-opt the Hollywood machine, which up until recently has been really great at connecting to audiences and reaching huge scales, and to try and encode in those vessels meaningful ideas about our future has been the project in many ways. Not to dismiss Hollywood as being, like, trashy and tropey and cliched and appealing to our lowest and primal instincts, but rather to co-opt those vehicles and try and use them to tell different stories, because entertainment and complex and critical ideas don't necessarily need to be separate. You can do both if you're good at it. And, if we want to make work around climate and around these critical issues of our time, then it's really our responsibility to find the forms through which people can relate to it. And that's the thinking behind these kind of hyperbolic narratives.
I so appreciate that. You're inadvertently or not kind of activating one of my bugbears, which is specifically the insularity of the kind of white cube, the white cube art world. And I felt really at odds with what I thought a career in the arts would be and what it felt like early on and what I observed it to be as a practice. And it's not that there aren't artists making really thoughtful, amazing work. I don't mean this as an attack on artists, but there seems to be a total lack of awareness among most people in the arts that largely this is basically economic weaponry from, at the highest levels, you have, 0.0001% dynamics that are then determining what gets allowed to be said and who gets allowed to say it or who's allowed to say it. And then creates a social dynamic based on scarcity. And it shuts down what it is that I'm going to the arts for, is that kind of expansive, mind-opening type of thinking. Related to that is, speaking of things being accessible, I also, and this is maybe my bias, so I'm not saying that you necessarily agree with this, but I've also observed that artworks that are incorporating narrative are often dismissed in the same way that, quote, accessible works are, where things that are deemed pretty, things that are deemed as trying to be too aesthetic are dismissed. And I understand the flip side of that, which is like, if you're giving too much sweet and no medicine, or too much sweet and no savory, then it's a cheap trick. I get it. But what's happening is that argument is then washing away all the potential of these more accessible, pretty narrative projects. And to be just very honest with you, it makes me crazy. I don't know. What is your experience of that been as you've tried to weave together those ideas?
Yeah, essentially, I'm a storyteller, and I make that type of work because I'm really interested in the extraordinary power of fiction. And again, I'm not trained as an artist. I'm trained as an architect, and just like the art world, architects typically communicate through a very coded and privileged language, the language of drawings, like plans, sections, site plans we already talked about. And, we exist in buildings like this for years, 7 years to become a licensed architect, learning that coded language. But if we value the ideas that we might be encoding in those drawings, if we value the way that we're talking and thinking about cities or reimagining what it means to live in space and the roles and relationships of us as communities existing in space with new technologies, if we value all that stuff, then it's negligent of us to continue to keep those ideas within those coded languages. But something like fiction is this extraordinary shared language. It's how our culture has always shared and disseminated ideas. And ever since we can sit up, we're in front of the TV consuming stories. We fall asleep in the pages of a novel. We go out on Friday nights to sit in front of flickering screens, and we laugh and we cry. There's such power in those mediums of story. And to dismiss them because they don't exist within the models of what the art world has prescribed, again, means to eliminate extraordinary capacity of narrative work to carry and communicate ideas and connect to people. So that's the work I make. And I don't think that there's resistance to that, at least in the museum sectors that I operate in. I don't sell privately. I don't very rarely go to art fairs, and I certainly don't show work in that context for the most part. And in those kind of commercial art circles, I don't operate in, and maybe there's much more reliance on the kind of the traditional language of the fine art world. But in museum context, they want people through the door, and they want to connect people to stuff and ideas and complex thinking. And they're desperate for work that's accessible. And it's why it's often dismissed as the Instagrammable nature of contemporary art. But really what museums are trying to do are find ways to bring different kinds of audiences through the door. And I'm really sympathetic to that. And I think there's bad ways to do it, and a lot of the Instagrammable art falls into that, where it's just sensation for sensation's sake, or it's just aesthetics, literally to create a backdrop for an Instagram square. But there's ways to use those same sensibilities in really productive forms. There's always going to be good art and bad art, but to dismiss all of the art that's attempting to be accessible as being bad, I think, is really dangerous. So I do think there's an audience for all that work. But again, that's part of why I'm here. Is that, yes, I make work for museums and art contexts, and work that's acquired in those seminal museum collections. But I also make music videos. And one of my day jobs is doing world building for the film and TV industry here. And I, run a master's program that's trying to help artists and designers make a transition into the entertainment industry in video games and in film, because I think that that's a really valuable place to be operating within. So all of my practice and, the way that I've set up my life has been an attempt to try and connect with as broad an audience as possible.
Yeah, I don't know how much you're at liberty to talk about or not. I know you've documented some of the work you did on Swan Song, for example, but I'd love to invite you to share, what is the range of work that you're invited to do when you're being brought in to Worldbuilding?
Yeah, that's what I find extraordinary about science fiction, is that it really has been the currency through which general audiences are able to talk about and visualize the future. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that work has fallen into tropes and cliche because it's done in a really lazy way, and it's not necessarily done with those intentions to kind of communicate and bring people along on ideas about the future. So I moved here to try and somehow, in a very small way, readdress that. So, what I really enjoy is coming on to the very early stages of production, like pre-production for a film or a TV show, before really the script is taking its full form, and to help build the world of that story. So on Swan Song, it's on Apple Plus. I think John Oliver says that Apple Plus is like a celebrity witness protection program, in that no one ever watches it. There's extraordinary stuff on there, and
they're very good at sci-fi, actually. They've really tried to make a body of good sci-fi.
Yeah, there's some terrible sci-fi on there as well. But
sure.
But besides Ted Lasso, people haven't really dived much deeper on Apple Plus. But buried in there somewhere is a very sweet film with Mahershala Ali and Awkwafina, directed by Ben Cleary and an Irish director, called Swan Song. And we came on in the early phases with the first production designer that was on, that then since changed, but it's a sweet film in the spirit of Spike Jonze's Her, which is talking about essentially a love story, a story of marriage in a moment where cloning is possible. And the story is, what happened. The lead has cancer or a terminal illness, has a beautiful partner, a young son, and is faced with a choice. He can clone himself without them knowing, into a disease-free body with all of his memories and ideas and everything about who he is, and they can continue on not knowing growing old with their husband and father. Or he can spend his last moments on Earth with the people that he loves, and they have to watch him die, but he gets to share those moments with them. And really, it's a story about love and marriage, but it uses this science fictional construct to strip away a lot of the other ideas and baggage of our world as a means to just focus on that story about sacrifice. What would you sacrifice for the people that you love? And that's often the way that science fiction operates, that we exist in a world, the fire hose of which is constantly flowing. And it's really hard to find moments of abstract thought. But what I like about fiction and science fiction especially is that it allows us to get outside of our own reality and look back in on it. A famous, Proust quote, like the real journey of discovery is not seeking new lands, but in seeing the place where we started with fresh eyes. And that's what science fiction is for me. So we created a lot of the visuals around what the robots in this world look like, what the tech might look like, what the augmented reality in this world might look like, in a way to make it feel very believable and seamless. One of the briefs I think in the early stages was like, what would the future look like if Apple designed it? Which is probably what's going to happen anyway. But it was very gentle science fiction as a means to foreground this story about human relationships. So that's what we would often do, is like try and support a production designer or a director in thinking about their world as a means to help them to really shape the story that they want to get into. And that might often mean that we exist in writers' rooms, essentially, as writers. There's a I don't know if I can talk, but I guess I can. We were in the writers' room for Gattaca for a little while. They're reimagining Gattaca as a TV series. It's since been put on hold with the strikes and so on. We were in the writers' room just as the writers' strike happened, and it hasn't come back to life yet. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Who knows? It's one of those stories. But Gattaca, when you're thinking about it, it's set in a future, and I can't really go into any details, but when you're writing a future, at every turn you're building a world. What do weapons look like in the future? Are they bullets? What does surgery look like? What does a hospital look like? What does border control look like? At every turn you're building world, and there are some writers that are extraordinary at that. But at the same time, someone like myself who has training in architecture and urbanism can really start to think about the physical fabric of that city, and do so in a way that not only thinks about it from a design point of view, but also thinks about it in terms of its narrative opportunities that those different choices you might make as a designer might set in motion. So existing in those writers' rooms is, I find, a really fertile space, because essentially you're doing the same work that I might do in my own practice as an artist, but you're doing it in a form that tens of millions of people are going to be watching. And that's the power of being here in a city like this, in an industry like the entertainment industry. It also, my time here also coincides with pandemics and strikes and you have reckoning of the end of the streaming wars with the distraction economy and the fact that no one watches film and TV anymore and everyone watches 30-second TikToks. So it's been really hard, actually, to find ways to cut through that. But, it will happen. I'm not the only person out here trying to do it either. But certainly, the power of the mediums of popular culture in bringing people along in these really critical conversations of climate change and the poly crisis is undeniable.
Mm. So with this work, you referenced like being in writers' rooms. And I think a lot of people, again, have a conception of what a writer's room is, but they've never been in one. What is that process like as a general, like a general description? And how do you typically fit into it? Are you actively part of these, episode to episode breaking story? Is it you're getting a brief in advance and coming in with your big presentation? Is it all of the above? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, it works in many different ways. Like every writer's room is different. Generally, the way that I like to work is that a writer might be breaking a story and doing a beat sheet of like, these are the different moments of an episode, or, this is our rough draft of a film. And they'll have a bunch of questions. And as they go through that, they'll say like, yeah, but like at this moment, they go into an underground club. And what would be an underground club in this world? Or at this moment, someone gets shot. Like, what does murder look like? What does a gun look like? And they'll just compile a list of stories. Then I'll come in and just riff off these questions. And then maybe I'll go away and do some design work, pull some references, do some visualization, some animations, some concept art, and come back in and essentially respond to those questions in the story and offer possibilities, a range. Like, what if it was like this? If you did it like this, then that would create this really interesting story moment that you could kind of play on. And when it works really well, you design the film or the show, but you also start to help guide story development, or at the very least, like potentially change its direction, because you're like, oh, I didn't think about it like that, but actually that creates this really interesting opportunity where this can happen, and we can use that in this way. And we found that someone might have a pilot already written, but then we come in and we start talking about it, and then they'll go away and they might rewrite that episode. Or they've got a general framework for a film, and we come in and we say, but yeah, well, like what, imagine if you set this against the energy transition. Like, what's the energy transition? Oh, well, we're in this really amazing moment where we can see the end of fossil fuels, and we're having to reimagine what, renewables look like. What if that meant there was this new kind of migration from the south up to fill all these jobs of people making, millions of solar panels in California? What would that start to look like? And that becomes a really interesting conversation, because this film had this particular idea about, a new working class and new prejudice against immigrants. Like, what if it was set against this context? So, you can really start to guide story, and thereby you can start to guide the messaging of a project, and in turn you can start to guide the sorts of things that an audience might begin to connect with and how they might start to relate to it. And that's when it works at best. I mean, sometimes what does a driverless car look like? And you just got to design a driverless car, and it's like, but I want it to be a driverless car that I've never seen before. And they're really not at all interested in like, wow, but like we can have really interesting conversation about critical minerals and their use in the electric vehicle industry. So maybe you have to kind of, like a Trojan horse, kind of slide those ideas in the back door, but that's still a way of operating parasitically in these in these parts of the industry in some form sometimes. But I still think it's a battle worth fighting.
Absolutely. So zooming out a bit on the subject of sci-fi, like you brought up Neuromancer earlier, and my mind is going to Snow Crash and the way that the metaverse got misappropriated from being a hellscape, a dystopia, into being an aspirational. I mean, ultimately it sort of became itself, because of course that what was being proposed in many ways was a dystopia, but packaged with, nice colors. There's this way in which we're now observing the broligarch class, willfully or not, misinterpreting sci-fi that was doing the work you're describing from earlier, like really surfacing hopes, fears, et cetera, in the zeitgeist and giving us a sort of a prismatic way of appreciating them. And that's being compressed and flattened into like cool pew-pew lasers. How are you thinking about that phenomenon? Like, first of all, are you observing that phenomenon? And then if you are, how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I think there's a great history of misappropriation of science fiction, but it's born in a misunderstanding about its role, right? Like, we often talk about science fiction as being a mechanism of prediction. And a lot of times that's what people are doing. They're like, oh, look, this person predicted the metaverse. Wow, they got it right. Like, we can have that technology today. Let's do it. Warren Ellis, the comic author, he talks about prediction is just a side effect of science fiction. Like, sometimes it happens. Sometimes, geostationary orbit is imagined in a narrative, and there it is. Sometimes we visualize like a communicator, and these kind of classical examples of when science fiction kind of gets it right. But that's not its point. It's not a medium of prediction. Its the value of a story isn't whether or not it comes true in 30 years or not. It's conceived of, and this is, great science fiction, it's conceived of as being a way of looking in on that present moment, as I've been describing. I often talk about the idea that, Orwell's 1984 isn't a great work of speculative fiction because we now occupy some Orwellian Big Brother reality. Instead, it's maybe an indication that we didn't listen, because 1984 is actually about 1948, the year in which it was written, and Orwell's observation of certain rises in authoritarianism and playing that out as a means to say, like, if we don't do something about this is where we might end up. And we never did something about it, and this is exactly where we ended up. So science fiction's role as being a mirror to who we are, I think is really its greatest strength. And when people start to look at a narrative and start to go, wow, could we really do that? What if we did do that? I think that becomes problematic, and really starting to use science fiction as a way to diagnose the zeitgeist and to start to play out various scenarios, not to see and to predict what could happen, but instead to inform us and arm us with sufficient knowledge in the present moment to be able to make the most appropriate decisions. So I often use the metaphor that, like, the future ahead of us is this dark and shadowed unknown territory, and every science fiction narrative, every story of the future, be it positive or negative, utopian or dystopian, is like a tiny little torch beam that illuminates a slither of that landscape. And the more stories we tell, the more of that possibility space becomes illuminated, the easier it is to know where we should tread next, because we can more clearly see the paths that are laid out in front of us. So I think that's the best way to start to understand science fiction, because, anyone's utopia is someone else's dystopia. And, a lot of the greatest tragedies of our age comes from utopias, the imagination being projected into reality. And that's not their role. Again, like, my works aren't blueprints, they're rehearsals. Planet City isn't a plan. It's a rehearsal of a possible scenario as a means to help us to figure out what we might do today. And the tech bros kind of co-opting science fiction as a blueprint for their lived reality is born out of that same problem.
Going into Planet City really quickly, I realized one thing I definitely wanted to ask you to share, because it's such a powerful part of Planet City, is some of these details that you've built into it, like the fact that there's all types of holiday celebrations going on all the time all around the city. And there's all these kind of data points that are then sort of manifest in narrative and artistic form. What are some of those?
Yeah, I mean, it's all born out of the idea that a big part of my work, and in many ways what I'm kind of known for, is imagining the subcultures of the future. So in a lot of my films, there'll be dance. There's a big emphasis on costumery and fashion. I'm really interested in like my early work around drones was looking at what I call drone couture, drone costuming. Like, what does a goth drone look like? What does a 14-year-old girl's drone look like? Like, how do we start to imagine misusing certain technologies in the way that certain subcultures do? And it's born out of another William Gibson quote, which is the streets find its own uses for things, right? Which is this idea of what happens when technology becomes democratized. And that's really its most interesting spot, like when you start to see the emergence of the current reality that we now live in with Web 2.0. That was when the internet, which began as like a military apparatus, became in the hands of everybody. Then you saw really its potential. Similarly with drone technology, there was this tipping point when we started to make a lot of work around drones. We did this project called Electronic Countermeasures, which was imagining like a discrete community-based peer-to-peer file sharing network located on a swarm of drones that would move into a space, distribute the network, and move away again. We did it at the moment where things like Pirate Bay were being outlawed, but it was also born out of a moment where there was a flip from the most drones in the air became civilian drones as opposed to military drones. And now it's possible to walk down to a literal toy store and for $100 get a 4K resolution camera drone and learn how to fly it like an expert in half an hour. Then you see we can fly a drone over an airport and cause $4 billion worth of damage. We can, we can start to see its implications at those moments. So that's kind of where we cite our work. So in Planet City, we were interested in what the cultural implications of the technologies that might underpin the city would start to look like. So we start to imagine, and we're doing a graphic novel around this story now, like a group called the Drone Shepherds, people that were based on the farms in the old world that migrated to Planet City and started to tend instead of tending to a flock or to a herd of cattle, started tending to the agricultural bots that are managing the city. And in the Planet City Carnival or festival, they would don and create masks referencing the beasts of burden of the past and kind of dancing those figures as a means for us to remember the way that we used to treat animals we once thought were beneath us. As a means to create new mythology around this idea of who we once were so that we would never forget and in turn never repeat our practices of extraction. And they sat within like a broader visualization of the Planet City Festival, because one of the things we did at the beginnings of the project was imagine what it would mean to bring all of the world's cultures together. We mapped on a calendar like every religious holiday, every festival, every carnival, and you realize that at any given moment around the world, there's some wild event happening. So you put all that together in one place, and Planet City actually is one giant festival. So we visualized this 365-day carnival that would snake its way through the city, like changing its form as it moved through a different cultural neighborhood. But really it was trying to visualize what would be a counter narrative to so much of the dominant science fiction imagery of our age, where with sufficiently advanced technology comes a form of flattening or form of globalization, where the Tomorrowlands of our future visions are steel and glass skyscrapers, or reimaginings of Brasilia, or 70s brutalism, where cultural assimilation starts to go along with new technologies, or where things like mythology and folklore and ritual become eradicated because they're quote unquote primitive or an artifacts of an age before enlightenment of technology and science. And again, a lot of hopeful and aspirational futures assume that those kind of practices of belief become something of the past, whereas we've always used myth and ritual and belief as a way of dealing with the unknown, and as a way of dealing with newness. In this new context that we're imagining, actually, they would be instrumental in helping people assimilate and cope with this new world that we're imagining. So we visualize ritual, and we visualize dance and joy and new forms of carnival and festival and new forms of costumery in Planet City as a means to have that conversation, to say that like these things we can carry with us, and those kinds of practices are really critical. And, you know, even in the densest cities that currently exist on Earth, when you have all of these unlike things and unlike people existing in one place, they don't get flattened at all, but rather their differences become heightened. And our most vibrant urban spaces are also the most dense. But in general science fiction, density is dystopian, it's congested and dirty, whereas in reality it's vibrant and active and full of life. So we try and visualize those kinds of futures.
Mm. Have you always been a sci-fi lover, or did that come at a later point?
I guess it was always there. I don't know where it started, to be honest. And again, to go back to my architectural roots, you know, I studied at a school that's desperately conservative, that no one in the design world would have even heard of. It's not on anyone's radar. It, you know, trained me in the fundamentals of space and space design, and, you know, designing houses and what it means to sit in a room eating breakfast with the sun washing across the wall, and the poetics of that moment. And I learned how to timber detail a house. And the design heroes of those moments were, you know, icons like Glenn Murcutt and Touch the Earth Lightly and all this sort of stuff. But the stuff that I would read almost like a kid under the blanket with a torch were the visionary architects of the 60s and 70s, groups like Archigram, you know, whose names comes from the amalgamation of the words architecture and telegram. And they didn't make buildings, but instead they made essentially zines as the vehicle of their architectural ideas. And they would visualize things like the walking city, which was a city literally on giant robotic legs that would move around the world, or plug-in city, which was a city, the infrastructure of which was a basic framework, a scaffolding, and, you know, living pods, shopping pods, leisure pods would be craned in and out, and it'd be endlessly reconfigurable. And what groups like that were doing was reacting to, you know, post-war British architecture in the case of Archigram, or, you know, a post-war conception of Europe where architecture was big and monumental and was trying to be timeless because it was just born out of a period of massive upheaval, and they wanted some sense of stability. But in the 60s and 70s, you know, new technologies of plastics and, you know, the disposable nature of consumer objects meant that maybe architecture could be considered differently. And instead of making a building as a prototype of that, they kind of would tell these stories about what future cities could be as a means to just to unsettle the status quo. And I would argue that those kind of speculative architects of the 60s and 70s potentially had more influence on post-war architecture than any single built object actually did. So, you know, these were all my heroes. And I guess that interest in visionary architecture ended up being translated into an interest in visionary cities, and in turn into science fiction as being the medium of those urban visions. But really, it's born out of an idea that, like, we've always used, you know, the urban imaginary as a site in which to play out ideas about who we could be. And I was interested in that, particularly, you know, when I was coming up, you know, as a 20, 21-year-old, like, I did work, as I mentioned, in these star architect offices. I did work for Zaha Hadid, you know, at a moment when she was starting to win all these commissions and doing her, you know, the biggest commissions around the world. And that was really what was understood at that time as the pinnacle of the profession. But you very quickly realize that avant-garde is actually desperate, you know, like deeply in the services of capital. The Dream Commission, even today, for the most part, is like a mega museum in the Middle East, or some like iconic like residential tower in China or something. And you're really, to a large extent, in the service of dictators and despots, or at least like those with the financial and mechanisms of power that can afford to employ you as an architect. But at the time in which I was working, cities were radically being reconceptualized based around mobile technologies and nomadic forms of infrastructure, driverless vehicles, forms of AI governance, drone technologies, and so on. And architecture was inherently a slow medium. Like, from napkin sketch to people walking in the door can sometimes be 20 years for a building project. And if the forces shaping cities were no longer the remit of architects and operating in the pace of architecture, if the forces shaping public discourse and public space were no longer the infrastructures of the public square or the piazza, but were instead the mechanisms of the platform, then what were the new spaces that an architectural designer might be able to operate in a way to affect change? And when those changes were occurring so fast, when there is the result of what I often talk about as before culture technologies, which is to say that the technology has arrived earlier and faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they might mean has, then you need forms of very rapid prototyping practice in order to get ahead of that technology transfer curve. So I started to be interested more and more in science fiction narratives because it became a way of playing out what the implications of these technologies might mean before they're already here, which is when traditional architecture would engage with them. And you started essentially becoming a science fiction author, imagining how cities would be changing through these technologies and visualizing what they would start to look like. And then you all of a sudden become a filmmaker because the best way to communicate those stories is through the mechanisms of film and imagery and animation. So, though it wasn't necessarily planned at the time, when I reflect on it, I can really see the kind of the very linear process of thought of like, well, I'm not really being very effective as a traditional architect. Oh, cities are radically changing because of technology. Oh, I've got to be a science fiction author in order to, speculate on what those technologies might mean before it already happens. Oh, now I'm a filmmaker because I've got to find a way to disseminate that science fiction narrative. And now here we are in Los Angeles making worlds. Yeah.
Making worlds and worlds for other folks to make worlds. What do you think are the unique affordances of architectural thinking as it relates to speculative fiction, world building, like folks that are coming from kind of other fields? What is architectural thinking going to bring that you don't see as much elsewhere?
Yeah, and I mean, the reason we're sitting here inside SciArc, I still work in an architecture school, in an architecture context for my, my academic practice. This world building program I could have set up anywhere, in a film school or in a design school. I chose to set it up in an architecture school because disciplinary wise, it sits in a really interesting place. Like, architects exist between culture and technology in a way that I find really fertile and productive. In a traditional architecture or undergraduate degree, you'll do classes in engineering and coding, but you'll also study fine art, and you'll do a life drawing class, and you'll make collages as well as 3D models and animation. And it's one of the last remaining disciplines that still values that breadth of knowledge. And to its detriment, in many ways, architects often think they can do everything because of that. But I think it's reasonable to imagine us walking into a bar and having a meaningful conversation with a film director or a scientist. And that's what I really value. And that's why I'm still here, banging on inside the architectural discipline, because in this moment, finding ways to synthesize and explore culture and technology and their overlaps and implications. You cannot separate technology from culture. I think as a discipline, we're uniquely positioned to engage in this present moment. And that's why I'm here. I think one of the great tragedies of the discipline is that breadth of knowledge is very often deployed as a service industry for the rich, creating like a a multi-million-dollar beach house for those that can afford it, or like I said, some icon for a dictator. But thinking about how that process of architectural thinking, which is really a process of spatial thinking, can be deployed in other contexts, I really am interested in. At its core, I think architecture is a process of telling stories with and through space. And if you just think about the discipline in those terms, and that buildings are just one very specific outcome of that process of training and thinking, then you can start to see a place for architects in video games. If people increasingly now are spending as much time in a virtual world as they are in a real world, then why aren't architects and urbanists playing much more instrumental roles in making those virtual worlds? An architect, as I do, helping to build the worlds for film and TV, I think is really valuable. But equally, an architect, that morphs into a politician or an editor or a writer, or a planner, or a curator, I think are all interesting and viable spaces to occupy. I mean, they need, forms of collaborative practice to support the gaps in knowledge. They need kind of additional training to help make that transition. It's not to say that an architect can run off and do all these things on their own terms, but I do think that base knowledge and understanding how we exist through and with space is really important.
Yeah, I'd love to invite you to share some examples of student work. You don't have to name anybody, but just to give people, because I remember when I visited your class where I met Al. So for super fans of the show, post, I met Al through your class. So that's one example of a type of outgrowth of architectural thinking in this less conventional way of thinking. What are some other examples, just to kind of flesh it out for people?
Yeah, there's lots of people that in the program, you don't need to have an architecture degree to come and do my master's, and we get people from film backgrounds or design backgrounds of all stripes and colors. But in many ways, it was conceived of, because of my background and my journey, as a place where people with a spatial design background, whether it's interiors or architecture or urban or landscape design backgrounds, can transition into these other forms of practice. In a context where the majority of design education imagines someone graduating, putting their work together in a PDF and applying for a bunch of architecture and design office jobs, I think really that more traditional form of practice is now very much on the margins. And for the most part, people come, especially to a school like SciArc, and they end up in all these different places, but they often do it through sheer hustle or force of will or just dumb luck. I wanted to create a master's program that would help people legitimately make a transition into other territories. So, people have graduated from the program and are now working in art departments as set designers and production designers, working on film, TV, music videos and commercials. Darren Aronofsky's Sphere, that immersive film, one of the set designers on that was a graduate from the program. We have people working as directors, both music video directors, commercial directors. We have people working in commercial spaces and branded spaces doing experience design and immersive experiences. Oftentimes, graduates ebb and flow with the rising tide of various industries. And the biggest growth industry right now in entertainment is live events. For various reasons, the distraction economy has killed traditional film and TV, but also the same systems have destroyed recording artist careers, and people aren't making money from album sales or music videos anymore. So a bunch of people have to get back on tour again, because live shows are the only way to make a legitimate income, and everyone needs visuals for their live shows. So I think at the last edition of Coachella, maybe there was 9 shows made or somehow touched by graduates from the program. Everything from Shakira's world tour, Taylor Swift's show, Blackpink, The Weeknd. Like, I don't know where your musical allegiances lie, but in some form, graduates from SciArc's Fiction Entertainment program have worked on those projects. A lot of people go into research practices, or design research practices, for offices, like in the guise of IDEO, but on projects around geoengineering. There's a bunch of people working on the LA wildfires, the Eaton Fire rehabilitation projects, and so forth now. So sometimes people, take these processes and methodologies of world building and they bring them into a research practice, or even back into an architectural practice, but a more expansive idea about what that practice might look like. I'm really interested in trying to help people deploy ways of working and thinking spatially in all of these different contexts. And that's not a weakening of the discipline. I think it's the opposite. It's a strengthening of the discipline, because it's looking for new arenas in which we might find traction.
I'm going to ask you to do my work for me for a moment based on that last comment, which is there a question about world building or spatial thinking, spatial design that you wish you would have been asked by now? Like, because you've done a lot of these interviews, you've had a lot of features written about your work. And I feel like there's probably got to be something floating around, some thought or thing of like, I never get to talk about this one aspect of it.
I don't know. I'm sure there is. I mean, I've done a million of these things now. Hopefully the ground has been covered. I don't know. What do I think are some really important ways of thinking about it? I mean, audience is one thing. Like we've talked a bit about accessibility, but really what we're talking about is audience. And I love to drill down into that more, because I design audience, in the same way that I design a project. Like I think about the audience as something that I need to be shaping and crafting. Like, who am I really talking to? Because ultimately, when we start to talk about audience, we start to talk about effect, and whether or not all the things that we've been talking about actually really translate, and do they really shift the needle? And it's often something that, I mean, I don't know if it's a question that's not asked, but it's certainly a question that isn't engaged with in this serious way that it should. When other speculative designers, speculative architects, world builders, whatever they may be, start to talk, like, to really honestly have an open conversation about whether or not these like projects to provoke conversation are actually doing what they're meant to do. Whether the rhetoric around which we might talk about them is actually playing out. Like, that's something that I think needs more honest assessment. Like, how do we really measure the success of one of these projects? Do we measure it by the number of people that watch it or connect with it? Like, how many people watched my TED Talk on Planet City? Is that a measure of success? Is it really changing the conversation around carbon removal? I don't know. But I think that's something we should be talking more about. And how we, like what constitutes a good world building project? Planet City has been acquired by MoMA. Does that mean it's good? We're still bombing the fuck out of each other. We're still, building more coal-burning power stations than renewables. We're still emitting more carbon every year on year than we should. Does that mean it's a terrible project and it's not working at all? Was it ever going to change that in any form? I don't know. These are important questions, I think, and I don't have the answer to them. I have anecdotal evidence of when people see a show or they watch a film and they talk to me about it afterwards, and that's always good, and it feels good when someone says that, like, yeah, my son saw great endeavor when it was installed at Tottenham Court Road station on the big, wraparound LED screens, and we had a conversation about carbon removal. That means something, but what scale is that working at? I have no idea. I can tell you how many millions of people watched the music video I did for Forest Swords, but again, what does that mean? So, like, trying to build some consensus around how we should judge the success of this work, I think that would be really important to start to do and to have more conversations about.
Need to get a social scientist in the fold.
Yeah, I mean, like,
doing some work with you.
I don't know, like, my work has changed a lot in recent years in that pre-pandemic, I would make works like Where the City Can't See, which is, I think, the first narrative film shot entirely using laser scanning technology. And it was developed in collaboration with the writer Tim Morn, the science fiction author, the grumpiest man in sci-fi, as I call him. We collaborated a lot. We collaborated together on a drone film called In the Robot Skies, which was a drone love story, basically. And his work is very much dystopian and imagining the unintended consequences of these technologies. And my work at that time and through the collaborations with him, would very much be cautionary tales in that I see the role as someone like me or an artist or a storyteller in this space as being someone who produces counter-narratives. And at the time, the dominant narratives around technology were aspirational. This was the peak of smart city tech and the beginnings of driverless technology and AI governance and drone systems. And they were marketed to us as, it's all going to make cities more efficient, more clean, connect us better to each other, give us better orgasms, whatever it was going to be. This tech was going to be great and solve all the problems of our world. So the necessary counter-narrative would be projects and work and worlds that would complicate that would say, yes, these drones can deliver vaccines to remote villages in Africa, but they can also shut down an airport or spy in a teenage girl's bedroom. Or, yes, smart city tech can help a bus arrive on time and can make the management of the power grid more efficient. But in order for it to really work, it requires the end of privacy and massive scale data capture and collection about our every movement and thought. So let's talk about that and surveillance systems. So, Where the City Can't See was shot with laser scanners because this is the system through which driverless cars and drones were seeing and mapping the world. And increasingly, as we start to reimagine and redesign our urban environments based not on human patterns of occupation and observation, but instead based on how a driverless car needs to map and navigate the edges of a street, it changes the value system through which that city is conceived. And we wanted to visualize what that looked like and get people thinking about how machines see and what that would start to mean. And we would develop LiDAR camouflage costumes that, to our own eyes is super exuberant and reflective and glistening because laser scanning works by shooting a laser at a surface, reflecting back to a sensor. If you can fuck with how that laser reflects back through some kind of shiny reflective surface, you can essentially create some kind of glitch or distortion or shadow in the data set. We developed in a project called Choreographic Camouflage a series of dance movements that would disguise the body from gait detection algorithms, particularly around the Hong Kong protests and post-COVID, as people were wearing masks either to protect themselves from tear gas or from contaminants and viruses in the air. We would see facial detection algorithms being less successful. So gait detection, looking at the patterns of movement and the proportions of our body being as unique as our face started to become more prevalent. But these algorithms, of course, are trained on the quote-unquote normal body. So if you can pin an arm behind a body, if you can move in a really asymmetrical way or fold your body in strange proportions, it means you start to disappear. So we develop this whole, vocabulary of movement that would make the body disappear. And at the time, those projects, I think, were really important and valuable to contaminate that conversation around technology, because everyone was just trying to sell us the tech. Because that's the point at which technology becomes valuable, the point at which it is monetized and can be sold, not the point at which it, is deemed productive for a community. But as the pandemic hit, the narrative shifted, and the narratives outside the window were of crisis, and were not positive at all, but were of the live action dystopia playing around us in real time. And that's when Planet City was born, was to try and reconceptualize what a story of the future would be, not as a cautionary tale, but actually as an aspirational story. And that's where my work currently exists. But it mirrors a pattern that's happened with another punk, climate punk or cli-fi, where our thinking on that genre was predicated in the idea that the dystopia, the cautionary tale, when we see how bad things could get, we would be forced to act. When we saw the narratives around climate migration on the screen, and we saw the catastrophe that was waiting for us, we would stop driving our SUVs. We would put on a sweater instead of turning up the heat. But we didn't do that at all. Like these cli-fi narratives, these dystopias really have just paralyzed us, that these problems now feel so big and so impossible that, what can one single person do in that context? And we just put our head in the sand and dial up Netflix and, set the world on fire even more. But an aspirational narrative, a hopeful narrative, that becomes something that does activate us. When we do see an alternative and we go, that's not too bad. That sacrifice isn't too great. I could see myself living in that world. Actually, densification doesn't mean that I have to sacrifice this, that I can still have a fresh strawberry. I can still hear bird song. I'm still connected to the water in the ways that I want to be. I can still be near my friends, and so on. Then you start to get buy-in, and you start to get people being excited about it, and you start to get people, wanting to find forms of protest and activism to try and enact those futures. So finding ways to, as Solnit says, be hopeful in the dark, becomes the new practice of futures. So the metrics of, and this is the long way of answering the question, but the metrics of success, then starts to become like, what are the sorts of narratives that generate action and that get people excited as opposed to paralyze people? So, that's a question of audience. That's a question of the effective nature of these worlds and how they can be effective. And the thinking around what's effective and what's not, I think, has shifted. And that's something we should be talking more about. Like, what are the stories that we need right now? And how can we tell them in the most powerful ways?
I found myself saying the Gramsci quote of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will a lot lately for reasons that I think bear no explanation. But I'm fascinated by this dynamic you're locating between, just to flatten it, pessimism and optimism, or sort of fear and hope, and like how you orient within it. And it sounds like you're advocating not for using one or the other as the only approach, but rather orienting within what the broader kind of zeitgeist is in order to provoke the type of conversation or change.
Yeah, I mean, I often use the phrase productive dystopias. Like, I think there's a real role for the cautionary tale. But at certain times, rather than others, those cautionary tales become more effective. And similarly, narratives of the future, like, speculative architecture as a practice, or, science fiction, it's always been there. But it makes more sense at some times than others. And right now, where there's so many balls in the air that we just don't know how they're going to fall, the future really is a project again, a necessary project again. And the role of speculation, you know, often we that speculation is a word, you know, typically is associated with risk, right? You speculate, you know, financially, economically, you speculate on something, you're taking a bet, right? But really right now, in the context of the poly crisis where we just don't know where we're going to end up, the risk is not speculating, is not playing out multiple scenarios as a means to try and figure out how the hell we want to get through this and where we want to end up. So, you know, we're desperately in this moment where we need these type of stories, but in other moments we need different types of stories. And that's, yeah, I guess what we're talking about is that just being mindful of what the dominant narrative is and what the most productive counter narratives might be. That's where we are, I think. Yeah.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to wind down this conversation, though there's many, many more I want to have with you. I'm flagging for a future one. I want to talk nuclear with you.
For sure.
But for now, I have 3 questions that I like to wrap up every conversation with. Inevitably, you've answered them in some capacity, so feel free to bring that back in and elaborate or take it somewhere totally new. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I don't know, fucking science. Really, like, if we're to describe my work in its plainest sense, I'm a science illustrator. You know, like, I take ideas that are often locked away in peer-reviewed journals or in, you know, disciplinary conferences and find ways to connect them to audiences. And these narratives, these science narratives around climate, around energy, are so fundamental to both who we are today and who we're going to be in a future that doesn't involve our rapid extinction. But we're just not engaging with it. And my algorithm is filled with, you know, Rogan-esque podcasts and thinkers that, like, you know, because it's this like really toxic and tragic combination of both extraordinary ignorance and extraordinary arrogance that says that, like, well, I can't understand how we get through the Van Allen radiation belt in order to land on the moon. Therefore, maybe the moon landing was a hoax, because my tiny fucking brain can't conceptualize of how the Egyptians built the pyramids. Therefore, aliens must have done it. Like, you know, having faith and trust in experts and believing in scientists and trusting that someone that devotes their life to a problem might know more than someone that Googles it on the toilet. This is one of the great tragedies of our age and why we are in many ways in the problems that we are in. So, boy, if we would listen to the scientists, that would help. And, you know, to foreshadow a future conversation around nuclear, there really isn't a scientist that pragmatically looks at the energy transition and imagines a way of moving away from fossil fuels that doesn't involve some degree of nuclear. And yeah, you know, there's a future Liam Young world building project trying to reconceptualize our relationship to nuclear and to redo the thought experiment of, like, what nuclear waste looks like, what a long-term storage solution looks like. That has to happen, because if you just follow the science, this is where we land.
I mean, it's how the sun works. The sun keeps giving us energy. What is one resource you would recommend to make better sense of reality?
Yeah, I mean, in these kind of questions where someone says, like, "Hi, what do you read? What are you inspired by?" Typically, I talk about science fiction and, like, oh, you should read science fiction. You know, the great J.G. Ballard quote, like, from the margins of an almost invisible literature comes the intact reality of the 20th century, right? The idea that, like, to understand the world, we should read science fiction. But I don't know, like, now we live in this science fictional reality. we occupy a science fiction present, and like, you know, really, I wouldn't say go and read science fiction. I would say get on a plane and go and see the world firsthand. Like, so much of my like speculative or fictional worlds begin in field research. Like, a big part of my practice is a documentary practice, and most of my fictions emerge out of documentary work. And you know, the other studio that I run is called Unknown Fields, that I run with another architect, Kate Davies, based in the UK. And what we would do would, you know, we'd kind of follow the zeitgeist, but rather than just make work about that, we would go there. You know, and this is before the, you know, the important conversations now around like critical minerals and you know, the supply chains of AI and so on. Like, I think it was in maybe 2013 or 14, we were in Bolivia looking at the emerging lithium industry, because, you know, Elon Musk just did his famous keynote, you know, that was at the time, before he went bonkers, heralded as like the most significant tech keynote since Steve Jobs launched the iPod or the iPhone, where he was proclaiming this vision of a green energy future, you know, based around the Tesla Powerwall and the Tesla solar tile on the roof and so on. He never talked about where the lithium would come from. He made an offhand comment about, you know, lithium reserves in Nevada or something. But, you know, just after that keynote, he was in Bolivia. So we got on a plane and went there. And we were some of the first artists that went to the lithium fields, the pilot plant in Bolivia. We kind of had those very early conversations with the activist communities and groups, like pushing back against it, with, you know, the government sector, who was trying to essentially nationalize the lithium industry and create an industry for battery production, as opposed to just shipping out the raw material to Korea or Taiwan to make the batteries. There's something to be said for that process of getting on the ground, not as a means to like pretend that we can understand things in a month-long trip, but to listen to people that have devoted their lives to a problem, and to use our platform that we had as filmmakers or storytellers as the means to disseminate that to the world. You know, we were some of the first people that went to Balto and literally stood on the edge of the radioactive lake that sits beside the world's largest rare earth mineral refinery. We did that in 2013 or something, you know. And that research has since been used, and the photography and the film work we did out there has since been co-opted by many, many people. But, you know, at the time it was important to go there and see it, to jump the fence and to tell that story. You know, some of the first drone footage of those lithium mines was from, you know, a drone I flew when Kate was like running diversion, talking to our minder, kind of pointing over here while I was secretly flying the drone over the world's largest lithium mine to get that footage. And, you know, there's something to be said for the revelations that come from getting out from in front of the screen and actually talking to people on the ground and finding ways to share their stories. So yeah, the world would be my
travel.
Very quick answer. To that. Yeah.
Well, I'm reminded of a term that I believe comes from winemaking. That's at least where I have transitively encountered it, of like the terroir, the air, the soil, the water, everything that's unique to that place is why that grape is that way. And so that's why you can't just transplant, you know, a grape from southern Spain to somewhere else and have it be the same. It might make a perfectly great other type of wine. But there's something similar about approaching large scale problems, or just the experience of being in a place where it's like you can imagine all day, watch documentaries all day, but actually being there, breathing that air, talking to people, there's nothing really to replace that. So I really appreciate that as an answer. So my final recurring question is, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Yeah, I mean, to follow from these narratives of field work, like, I mean, that kind of travel is an extraordinary privilege. I guess. Like, it's not many people have access to that. You know, and again, it's not like this form of colonial travel. Like, it's genuinely about trying to connect with people on the ground who have devoted their lives to being there and trying to document that work. But the biggest revelations have come through that practice. You know, like I have hundreds of stories of this, but there are a few that stick in the mind. You know, like we did a whole series of trips, Kate and I, on board container ships traveling around the world, you know, seeing the mega ports of Asia. We did this project that was tracing the supply lines of technology from like the high street Apple store all the way back to the rare earth mineral mine where those technologies began their life. And a big part of that was exploring the shipping industry, like this giant distributed megastructure of global shipping that essentially builds our world. I was lucky enough, not by design, but just by chance, the Maersk ship I was on, the captain had been a Maersk captain for 40 years or something, and this was his last trip.
Wow.
He was retiring at the end of this trip, so his wife was with him on board, and he was very much in the mood to reminisce and to tell stories because he'd seen, you know, the birth of that industry and its change across time. And he tells this amazing story about algae in the oceans, like going through the warm waters. He used to not have to navigate with charts or now with GPS and so on because he could just follow the line of ships before him, because as the propellers would churn up the water, they would leave this luminous trail of bioluminescent algae behind that would kind of mark the shipping lanes. And at the same time, you know, toilets on these ships, they're flush with seawater, so you wouldn't have to turn the light on in the bathroom when you go to the toilet, because you could just you'd flush it and the whole bathroom would glow green. But now he just simply tells this story that he has to turn the light on when he goes to the bathroom at night again, because the life in the oceans has been eradicated by that 40 years of shipping that's played out across his career. So this very extraordinary, real moment of turning the light on or not has buried within it the story of the death of the ocean as being a site of myth and mystery, of life and fertility, to being a conveyor belt for the world's goods, you know. And there's a million stories like that. You know, there's another one that sticks in my mind. We were in Madagascar looking at the supply chain of the world's luxury goods. You know, most of the world's sapphires and gemstones come out of the illegal mining fields of Madagascar, for instance. And again, by chance, we found ourselves next to a little piece of really beautiful rainforest that had a fence around it. And beside that rainforest was an indigenous community that once lived in that rainforest that had now been displaced from it and living in kind of mud flats beside it. And we got closer, we realized that there was a sign on the fence, an Air France sign. What that piece of rainforest was the literal end point of Air France carbon offsets. You know, like when you're flying on Air France and you are offsetting your carbon, that was essentially protecting a little piece of Madagascan rainforest. The result of that protection was the displacement of the indigenous community that called that rainforest home have now been excluded from it as a means to satiate white guilt about air travel. So you see the extraordinary complexity of climate narrative. And the extraordinarily difficult choices we have to make and we're faced with constantly. And you see in those moments what goes on behind the scenes of the modern world. Both, you know, when we call up, you know, a pair of shoes on Amazon and we expect them to arrive the next day, or we upgrade our phone, or we carbon offset our flight with 2 clicks. what is the massive planetary infrastructure that lies behind the scenes, and those little kind of anecdotal moments reveal the mechanisms of planetary trade and globalization. They're the ones that kind of stick with you.
Stories and architecture combine.
Stories and planetary infrastructure combined. Exactly. Yeah.
On that note, Planet City is traveling to Art Science in Singapore soon. Is anything to share about that show and any other things you have on the horizon worth sharing?
Yeah, I mean, what I've finished this year was a show at ACME, the Australian Centre for Moving Image in Melbourne. That was a collaboration with Kerry Elmsley, who is the Director of Programming at ACME, and two other amazing curators, Amanda Hascard, a First Nations curator in Australia, and Chelsea O'Brien. And we created a show called Future and Other Fictions, it began as an attempt to catalogue hopeful visions of the future in popular culture. It very quickly morphed into talking about the necessary visions of the future that we need today, because the catalogue of hopeful visions is a pretty short list, actually, when you really get into it. So it became like this bringing together of like Afrofuturist visions and island punk and spice punk and silk punk and different ways of thinking futures. I did a new project called After the End, which was a collaboration with the First Nations actress and producer and writer Natasha Wanganeen, who was the young child star of Philip Noyce's Rabbit Proof Fence. We wrote a project about the end of fossil fuels and what would happen when these sites of infrastructure from which First Nations communities were historically displaced would be given back. And how would you reclaim that territory? Would these dinosaurs of a dead industry exist as scars in the landscape? Would you dismantle them and return them to the earth? Would you reoccupy them in new ways, telling those kind of narratives? Which was really the end point of a whole journey through the exhibition, talking about the necessary future narratives of the moment and both the present moment, but also the moments in which many of these stories were created. So there was like some of the movie miniatures from Blade Runner and all these things were in that show. It's a long way of saying that show is now traveling this year to Singapore, to the Art Science Museum, where a new version of that show, maybe a sequel is the best way to describe it, opens in September. That will be a big proportion of that Future and Other Fiction show from Melbourne, but it'll also be localized with extraordinary work from Southeast Asia futures and science fiction. And that's where, like, building on like terms that I had only recently been introduced to, like silk punk and spice punk and island punk, which is loose terms to describe a lot of the science fiction emerging from that region. But the core of the show, I'll be bringing a lot more of my own work. So I'll be bringing Planet City, Great Endeavor. After the End, of a new project called World Machine, which is about the physical infrastructures of AI and how we could reimagine essentially what is a planetary computer that we're building in a way that doesn't repeat the extractivist models of colonial infrastructure. So they'll all come together in a new show around future fictions for Singapore. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm very excited. Hope I get to see it.
Come check it out. Exactly.
Liam, this has been awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, me too. Me too.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you. This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.